Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is The Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. You need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
When you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is another edition of the Cameron Parker Show. It is the draft, kind of analyst point of view Cameron Parker Show, and I am joined by High Huddle's Nick Kendell, or is it Rick or is it Morty? I guess we should figure that one. I'm guessing you're a Morty, right? I'm kidding. We all have a Rick in us. Let's be honest. We all have a Rick in us, as well as a Morty.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, it's kind of a fabulous show. I mean, we're getting to that point. Carl and Sayre, who's over at Predominantly Orange, Carl over at High Huddle. This is appropriate because one of your guys is going down to the Senior Bowl this upcoming week. As well as one of my guys, Sayre Bettinger, is going down to the Senior Bowl, and it feels like we are just inching ever so closer to the NFL draft and free agency. And usually, you start hearing rumblings before the draft. I should say the East-West Shrine games and the Senior Bowl and the NFL, what is it, the Collegiate Bowl? That's one of the kind of the under-the-radar ones that not many people know about. But you kind of hear rumblings before that. But then you kind of start to see maybe the icing on the cake, potentially, or different stories that unfold, around that. So it's kind of an exciting time right now if you're a Denver Broncos fan, knowing, that they will be coaching arguably maybe the best Senior Bowl roster that has been constructed in, maybe the last, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it's definitely a great Senior Bowl roster. A bunch of guys dropped out, unfortunately. Announced yesterday, which definitely hurt a lot of the talent. But still, you got some of the big names, pretty good offensive line group, pretty good linebacker group, and obviously two intriguing quarterbacks in Baker Mayfield and Josh Allen. So it's going to be an intriguing group of the Senior Bowl, and definitely the best thing that's happened to the Broncos this season. Getting a high pick and being able to coach the Senior Bowl, after a rough 5-11 season, at least it's something positive that fans can look forward to.
No kidding, and one of those positives that we'll get to a little bit later on, is that the Senior Bowl roster on the north side sure seems like it's loaded with a lot of offensive talent, which, you think of where the Broncos were this last season, they struggled mightily on offense, whether it was the offensive line or particular the quarterback position, and potentially even tight end as well. They struggled mightily in those areas. And so having that opportunity to really kind of get the nitty-gritty of a lot of the position players that have, shall I say, declared for the Senior Bowl. I guess that's kind of or at least been accepted to go to the Senior Bowl. It's just, it's nice that, and appropriate, I should say, that all of the staff that is now newly constructed because of all the waves of new coaching hires that happened under Vance Joseph. It's appropriate now that through everything that they get kind of nitty-gritty with a lot of the offensive talent there at the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. There's a decent amount of offensive talent here. Again, some people did leave. We had Mason Rudolph back out, but, Tanner Lee takes his place, a guy that I know you are familiar with there at Nebraska, or the team that's just been getting kicked around by that team east of it. But that's neither here nor there.
Right, exactly.
Offensive line. Yeah. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Were you excited to see all those UCF players added?
Yeah, one guy in particular that I think is going to catch a lot of the eyes of players is the Shaquem Griffin. I don't think a lot of people really realize kind of how good he is. I mean, maybe some of the drafters, I know how good he is, but he, despite playing with really one hand, he has a pretty high motor, and he has the ability to really get to a quarterback with just one hand, and I think that really bodes well for him as far as draft evaluators. I mean, so I think guys like that could really benefit.
Yeah, for sure. I think the Central Florida guy that I like the most is Mike Hughes, but he's not here. He's graduating early. But here, out of the Central Florida guys that are coming into the NFL, I'm pretty intrigued by the tight end. Jordan Atkins, 6'4", 262 pounds. I mean, he had a great season this past year. He's pretty squat. He could, obviously, most tight ends coming out, especially ones from spread systems, have a lot of inline and blocking work, but I think he has the frame for it. And it looks like he has some down-the-field athleticism as well. And I'm not really that big of a fan of this safety, linebacker, cornerback group at the Senior Bowl this year. So I think that he has a chance to really shine a lot like these other tight ends too. I mean, Ian Thomas from Indiana, Adam Brenneman from UMass, Dallas Goedert's a guy that's really interesting. Could play pretty darn well, and I'm pretty interested in Tyler Conklin as well. He's the brother of, I believe it's Jack Conklin, the tackle for Tennessee. Yeah. Played for Central Michigan, pretty good in the air. So, interesting group of tight ends. This is not like a great tight end class this year as far as top talent. Like, there's not a David Njoku, Ingram, O.J. Howard level talent. But I feel like there's a lot of depth in that end of day 2 to beginning of day 3 range. And almost all those guys are here this year. So, I'm excited to watch some of those guys.
Yeah, the tight end class, I think, is really interesting this year. Because, last year it felt like there were a lot of really good front of the end tight ends, with Adam Shaheen and O.J. Howard and David Njoku and Evan Ingram kind of headlining that crew. But there really wasn't anybody kind of underneath it necessarily that were good tight ends. Not great tight ends, but just that were good enough tight ends that solidified potentially themselves, that if they didn't get a Mark Andrews or a Dallas Goedert, there are players that are beneath that are good enough that can actually solidify a position of need. And I think that's why it's a little bit intriguing, with those guys like like Brenneman. I think that with what he did at Penn State, you should at least put him on the map. That he played with a big program, and I think that. Well, I don't exactly have the stats in front of me, but he had a really good catch percentage from everything that I heard from Pro Football Focus, that they have with college football. He was, every single ball that he was thrown, it seemed like he could catch everything. And so, you think of him, Fumagalli from Wisconsin, Mike Gesicki from Penn State. It's kind of I don't know how to put it, but it's kind of like a quiet class. But it's a quiet and maybe unheralded tight end class, I should say. Maybe
somebody out of this group is going to step up, and somebody out of this group is going to be, maybe more than one, is going to end up being a pretty good player. So you just got to groom through, make sure you find the right one, because there's depth that matters. Getting them in the right system, picking your guy, and developing them. There's a couple. There actually is one at the Shrine Bowl too. I wanted to touch on is a guy named Jordan Thomas, Mississippi State. He's played wide receiver his whole career. But they're asking him to move in line, and he could be a really good receiving tight end. He's massive. He has over 34-inch arm length, so he's got a big catch radius, big hands, and he weighs 270 pounds. And he played wide receiver at Mississippi State. So he's a really interesting weapon, and if they can, he might be a year out as far as a big receiving threat, kind of like how Adam Shaheen was last year. But that size with that athleticism is a rare package. So he might be somebody that will be announced that's been moved up after the game. So watch out for him as well. He's interesting.
Let's get into it on that East-West. We'll talk a little bit more about the Senior Bowl, obviously, but the East-West Shrine Game, that's tomorrow. And there's really not, it's not a loaded roster, but there's probably some players in here, that will make their name. You think of some of the players that were there, Jimmy
Garoppolo.
There in the past that played, or have played, exceptionally well in the NFL, and even just guys that kind of were under the radar and then kind of made themselves a household name, whether it was in practice or, just kind of off to the side. So this is like that second tier, I guess, all-star game next to the Senior Bowl, that maybe not many people, want to focus on a whole lot. But the East-West Shrine Game certainly matters.
Yeah. I think Justin Simmons was in the Shrine Game and a few other Broncos as well. So it does matter, and the Broncos are there, picking through. A few of the guys that have stood out to me, I really like, going into the game and some of the stuff I've heard about him. Joe Osman from Central Michigan's an interesting guy. He's 6'2", 250 pounds, so he's pretty much going to be an edge rusher, and he led all of college football in sacks this season. So he's an interesting guy who's been doing pretty well down there. I got to call out Joel Lanning, the Iowa State quarterback / linebacker. He's apparently been playing pretty well, racking up a lot of tackles. I want to see how he tests physically at the combine, but he's definitely a smart guy, a versatile guy, a guy that a lot of players rally around him, and it hurts me to talk well about an Iowa State person. So I really need I've been a big fan for a while of Leon Jacobs. He's kind of played all over that Wisconsin front. You probably remember talking about that Miami-Wisconsin game. I was like, oh, yeah, I like this Leon Jacobs guy.
Yeah.
He's really smooth and athletic. He's still kind of raw because they've played him everywhere. I think he's played some tight end, some fullback, linebacker. They've moved him everywhere, but he's really a good athlete and pretty smooth, and somebody I would be okay taking as a depth linebacker, a guy that can play special teams and potentially develop into something because the tools are there. I've been interested in the guy from Northern Iowa, too. Darius Fountain, he's been killing it as well. Huge catch radius, and he's beating guys deep. He's beating guys on screens. He has like a different level than most of those other guys there. So he's somebody that's been killing it, and I'm really excited to follow going forward.
And I think I was just going to pick on the quarterbacks a little bit, but it's kind of an interesting group. It's not going to be a group that may not even crack a quarterback job in the National Football League, but it's a very interesting group. Especially you look at the East roster, with guys like Riley Ferguson, from Paxton Lynch's old school, and then you go to Quentin Flowers, the guy that really came along actually quite well late into the season for USF.
He pulled out, by the way. He won't play tomorrow.
He did pull out?
And he had a family issue or something, so he's out tomorrow.
And then your favorite quarterback, J.T. Barrett of Ohio State University. Yeah.
He's my favorite because he likes to throw touchdowns to Hawkeyes.
Right, exactly. That was a bad game for Ohio State. It was a good game for the Iowa Hawkeyes. But it's kind of an interesting group because it's a lot of notoriety of players. At least for the quarterbacks of the East, but there's not a lot of, I guess, NFL potential, if you'll say. Nick Stevens is there for Colorado State. He's, I guess, somewhat intriguing, but he's kind of had a very up and down season, really, with Colorado State.
Yeah. Honestly, the one that I think is probably the most likely to come out of here and do something based on what people have been saying down there is Nick Shimonik for Texas Tech. He's only played 1 year there. He's actually again, bringing it back to Iowa, he's a transfer from Iowa. He didn't beat out C.J. Beathard, and he's got a pretty live arm. He spins it pretty well, and he's been one of the guys who's been being able to throw some of more of those NFL throws, like the deep outs and everything, there in practice. Ferguson's got a big arm, but he's been erratic, and he weighed in under 200 pounds despite being 6'4", so they're really concerned about his weight. And the other guys have been like solid. You know, JT Barrett's a solid guy, but NFL teams don't see him as a quarterback, you know, and I don't think he's got the athletics for other spots, so it's unfortunate. I mean, counting him out, but we'll see what happens. He might be great, but everything that it sounds like, it doesn't sound like there's guys that are very high on him.
Well, I mean, you know, kind of take it from my point of view of what Tommy Armstrong was. I mean, Tommy Armstrong was a terrific athlete, you know, at quarterback, but he wasn't those guys that just are going to blow the doors off, you know, of a defense by throwing it, you know, all over the yard and making terrific throws, you know, when it matters. And I mean, there was that games; those are the games against Oregon, obviously, and whatnot. But I mean, so JT Barrett, I think, is underratedly athletic. But if he has a future, it's got to be a different position. You know, tight end, running back. You know, I certainly don't see him as a wide receiver, but
Canadian quarterback.
Right, maybe Arena Football League, Canadian Football League quarterback. I mean, so there are the possibilities are there. But yeah, so in your estimation, Nick, what is the deepest position necessarily for the East and West run game? Because I mean, you know, you have guys like Casey McDermott who could potentially be, you know, a potential draft pick from the University of Miami. I mean,
yeah.
What is the deepest position, I should say, in the East-West run game?
Maybe defensive line. I'm not really sure. There's guys that, you know, you can pick out of here, but there's some pretty good defensive line talent's been doing well. I think Chad Thomas got a call up from Miami. He's more of a 4-3 defensive end, you know, not probably athletic enough to be a 2-point stance guy in a 3-4 front. Contavious Street's been playing great. He's a guy who's a tremendous athlete. NC State opposite of Chubb, but a freak athlete and a guy that hadn't quite yet brought it to the field, but he's been dominating down there. And Folorenzo Fatakusi from that's a mouthful, isn't it? From UConn is a guy that's done some stuff as well. Smaller defensive tackle that's been doing some things is Puna Ford from Texas, a smaller guy, but an interesting one nonetheless. And and again, I mentioned Joe Osman earlier, so there's some defensive line and rushing talent. I'm pretty underwhelmed by the cornerbacks, the secondary in general. I don't think it's an amazing secondary year. And I think there's some decent talent in the wide receivers as well. Bryce Bobo's been playing well from Colorado. He was an interesting one. I mentioned Jordan Thomas, who's kind of tight end like that. Deshaun Hamilton's been playing very well also from Penn State. So there's some talent here.
You know, one player that I look at, and it's Javon Wims from Georgia.
He's injured.
He's injured, but I feel like he could potentially have a future based on the size and the potential for him to maybe add a little bit more weight. Maybe, I mean, he's at 215. So it might be a little bit lanky, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think as far as his ability to, I guess, get off the line quick, because he's kind of a speedster, if I remember right. Versus,
he's okay. He's okay.
I mean, it's not those guys that's like going to be, you know, I guess in awe the minute you see a guy on tape, but it's one of those players that's, you know, maybe does the little things right, I should say, but it's not going to be, I guess, surprising to see him make a. I don't know. I'm kind of rattling on.
A couple other guys I did want to touch on. Just a couple other guys. Brett Toth from Army's been playing pretty well. He's got pretty good size, moves decently well, and he's physical and obviously pretty good technique. He's probably more of a swing tackle coming in, but an interesting guy. Late, I think he might have military obligations for 2 seasons if you draft him, so you might have to wait on him. But kind of an interesting guy, especially if you don't want to put a guy I don't know what the rules are with that. Is he technically going to be on the 53? I'm not sure, but he's an interesting guy. And then there's a guy from Wagner as well who's been moving pretty well. I think his name is Sinat. He's huge. He's like 6'7", 310 pounds, and he's another interesting guy deep as well. So I'm actually pretty intrigued by this offensive tackle class. It's definitely a needed one after last season being historically thin.
Yeah. And I guess with that, how many of these players then are those kind of swing tackle types? Because that John Elway, at least historically, has kind of liked those, swing players that are on that offensive line, guys that can play guard or guys that can play left tackle or right tackle. Menelik Watson, for example, was, kind of that of that ilk. He could play right tackle, he could play left tackle. He showed the ability to play guard at times. So
yeah, just some versatile guys.
Right. So I think that it seems like John Elway's kind of going to that type of offensive line.
Yeah, you need guys that can fill different roles and have different strengths. So if there's an injury, you have some versatility on one side or the other, and you can just keep building and make the offensive line as good as you can. It's a puzzle piece. You have to be able to move guys around and figure it out, and hopefully it clicks into place. But in this, I think Brett Toth could potentially add some weight and move inside more of a zone guy. He's probably not ever going to be super strong to move guys off the point of attack like that. Mark Corti from Alberta, another Canada guy. He's kind of an interesting one. He's a little smaller. He might be a guard or a center. He's had a decent week. And then there was a guy from Syracuse as well. I'm trying to remember his name off the top of my head. He had an injury, but he's kind of got good size. Oh, Jamar McGloster. So there's some interesting offensive linemen here, but probably these are like your 6th, 7th, maybe 5th round guys. Maybe one will move up there, but nothing super exciting.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking too. Just overall with the just kind of that East-West Shrine game, very rarely are you ever going to get a guy that, it just kind of blows the doors off, to use that terminology again. I mean, these are guys that are, depending on, because there have been players that play in the East-West Shrine game and then get promoted to the Senior Bowl the following week. There have been players that have done that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But,
we've had some this season. Boone Ford was one.
Okay. So, typically the guys that are in the Senior Bowl, at least, especially this year, a lot of them could end up being first-round picks. First to at least third-round picks. Probably just with talent alone.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely going to be some first-round picks here. It's a pretty good Senior Bowl group. And Broncos got a pretty good crop to look at as well.
Absolutely.
I hope they can get a look at some of the South roster, because there are some talents on the South that intrigue me a lot. But I think they had to. There's a little bit of exchanging going on. Guys like kids at a table exchanging desserts. I'll give you a couple pieces of my Reese's Pieces if you give me a couple Starbursts, that kind of thing. So the Broncos got to look at Baker Mayfield and Josh Allen, but they have to give up a couple other guys to do that, which is fine.
Let's dive into it. Let's get into the Senior Bowl a little bit and talk about that North roster, because it feels like there actually is a decent crop of running backs, wide receivers, especially quarterbacks, because they're going to get a look at Baker Mayfield and Josh Allen, and I'm not going to talk about Tanner Lee because I'm afraid I may intercept it. But really, you think about it, it's really kind of a loaded group, just all the way around. They're going to go look at the Colorado State wide receiver, Michael Gallup, who I really like. Akram Wadley, who I think is very underrated. He'll probably end up being a third down back. You know more about it than I do with Wadley, watching a lot of his games. But, there's the Jalen Samuels guy that we were talking about earlier today. So there is a very good group, I should say. And the defensive players probably aren't I guess, the guys that are going to be on that South roster. But nonetheless, there still are some pretty good, talented players on the defensive side of the ball still with the North squad.
Yeah, it's. I guess I'll start with defense then, because there are some interesting guys here. The Broncos might be moving on from Aqib Talib pretty soon. There's that rumor today that they might be looking to trade him. Nothing would surprise me, really. He's got a big contract, and he's an aging vet on a team that sounds like they're going to make a move for Kirk Cousins. So they're looking at all their options. Not surprising. Duke Dawson is a guy that I think would be pretty good third cornerback. He doesn't really have the size or the length to be a boundary corner. Played at Florida, one of the few players on that defense that stood out this season. And he's a nickel corner for sure, but with Roby and Harris, you can get that third corner. If the best one's on your board is a nickel corner, you can use him. So he's an interesting one. I really like Isaac Idiom from Boston College, a good length guy. And they actually have a few good length guys as well. Demarcus King from South Carolina, 6'2", 190. I think he had 2 interceptions in the bowl game against Michigan. So he's interesting. And then Christian Campbell from Penn State, another interesting guy, 6'1", 200. So interesting all around. And then they had one more guy on the cornerback group that I like a lot is Darius Phillips. He's 5'10", 190, but man, he moves so smooth, and he is he's a Dory Jackson light. I think he's a little bigger. He's got a better size to him, but he's explosive. He can make plays on the ball, and he's been dynamic in kickoff returns and punt returns for him. So there's some interesting talent for the cornerbacks.
Another, well, I guess I should say the biggest position of need aside from the quarterback position is the offensive line. And it certainly feels like this group of the offensive line is pretty darn good. I mean, they're not going to get a look, I believe, at Quentin. Quentin Nelson. Obviously, that's on the Quentin Nelson. That's on the roster, I don't believe. But you're going to get a look at guys like Wyatt Teller. Tyrell Crosby at the tackle spot. Brian O'Neill. Scott Quisenberry. Let's see.
Will Hernandez,
Will Hernandez.
Sean Kugler, who's now our interior offensive line coach, so definitely knows him there. Chukwuma Okorafor, who's 6'6", 330. Pretty good mover, especially for his size. Still pretty young. And again, the guy we talked about that was brought up, Brett Toth, invited to show out at the Senior Bowl as well from Army. So there's some interesting guys there. And Cole Madison, some people were talking about him at tackle, but he's a guard, and they have him listed as such on the roster. And I wouldn't be surprised if they look at Tyrell Crosby at guard as well.
And I guess as far as we go to the defensive line, really the only guy that stands out maybe on that defensive line, just more defensive tackle, would be a guy like Harrison Phillips. He's kind of at that age. He's kind of at that weight, 295, that is not, maybe he's not to what DeMarcus Walker was last year, because, DeMarcus Walker was 280 coming into the National Football League. But, he's getting to that, I think, Malik Jackson weight, not to what he was coming into the National Football League. But he's got a good enough size to him that he could be, I think, flexible to where he could play the defensive end spot or, inside, depending on if they decided to move away from a guy like Derek Wolfe if they decided to.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how Harrison Phillips will do. He has pretty good hands, and he plays with great leverage, and he was pretty productive this year, but there are times that I see him get blown off the line, so these drills, especially for up front, they will be very telling for where a guy's at physically. I am interested to see Nathan Shepard as well. From what I've seen, he plays with his hair on fire, and he has pretty tremendous length. He's probably a project of some sort, but still has that length and potentially that ability that Bill Collar loves. So, he's going to get his hands on these guys. So these defensive tackles, he's going to know which ones he likes. And I like both NC State guys as well. Justin Jones and B.J. Hill. That NC State line this year was one of the top 3 in college football, top 3 to 5 in college football. So pretty good group. And you mentioned that there also are some edge players that I'm interested in. I'm not really that big on Jalen Holmes or Chad Thomas for the Broncos, unless you think Chad Thomas can put on 20 pounds, which I'm not sure if you want to do that to him. But Ogbania Okoronkwo from Oklahoma is an edge rusher that's pretty intriguing, probably a late day 2, early day 3 guy, because he doesn't fit the size prototypes, but he's been effective there. And I'm also interested in Taquan Lewis from Rutgers, who's got some potential, really long arms, and at that size and ability where he has some stand-up edge ability on top of it.
Yeah, you look at some of the guys, even for going back into the offensive side of the group, the wide receiver position is pretty good. I mean, Braxton Berrios, Cedric Wilson, Michael Gallup, Alan Lazard. I mean, there are some really good wide receivers on the Broncos roster, particularly Alan Lazard. You think of at least those big wide receivers that are 6'5" and have good enough weight to them. And considering where they are with Demaryius Thomas, do they decide to move on from a guy like that and potentially draft kind of their newfound big wide receiver? Well, then Alan Lazard might fit the bill. If they were to go for maybe their true slot receiver, rather than go to the free agent market and sign a guy like, I don't know, Paul Richardson, if they decided to, maybe just make him as a true slot guy, or maybe make him as a number 2. I don't know.
I wouldn't put Paul Richardson in the slot.
No. I think he's more of a number 2, though.
Yeah, he's kind of a deep guy. That's where he makes his plays down the field. He's never been really great underneath as far as his routes go.
He's definitely a poor man's Emmanuel Sanders. I mean, really, for Paul Richardson, he's just kind of a poor man's Emmanuel Sanders.
Yeah.
But so the true slot guy could be a guy like Braxton Berrios. He's kind of a hard-nosed guy, and you think of what was there kind of at the Senior Bowl last year. I think Ryan Switzer was there. Tywan Taylor was there. So there have been some quality slot receivers that have come, at least in the past, and it maybe not be as a loaded slot receiver group, maybe, as last year, but Braxton Berrios, I think, would be a really good one to at least consider. I mean, it just feels like he does all the little things well, and who knows what, their future holds for a guy like Kenny Bell, who I really like. I just think that the injury history that he's had and all sorts of stuff that he's had off to the side, not off the field stuff, but just, him not getting at least 10 to 15 pounds heavier, I think is a little worrisome. But, then again, Emmanuel Sanders, at least on the Denver Broncos roster, is clocked in at 5'11" and 180. So it's certainly possible to play, I guess, at a lankier height, lankier weight. But, you kind of wish that a player like that would add a little bit more pounds. So, but Braxton Berrios, I think, is a really good, just true, move the chains slot receiver.
Yeah, and you left me the 3 guys that I'm actually most intrigued by. And I guess I don't really know that much about Justin Watson from Penn, who's just added, but Jaleel Scott from New Mexico State, 6'6", 215, very acrobatic, just a guy who can make plays in the air with a huge frame. I really like the dog mentality that I see from Jamon Moore from Missouri. He's going to need to get bigger, but he's definitely intrigued me when I've watched Missouri. When Bach, was kind of hyped to be a potential first-round pick this year, he's returning. Would chuck it down the field. A lot of times it was Jamon Moore who was the guy who was coming up with it. And then Cedric Wilson is an interesting guy as well from Boise State. I honestly think he might be better long-term than Gallup. I think he's got more down-the-field ability. Smart guy, 6'3", 188, kind of has different gears where he can track the football down the field. And a former quarterback as well. So he's somebody, watching that, I think it was the Las Vegas Bowl where Oregon played Boise State. He was somebody that I think he had like 170 yards and 2 touchdowns or something. He was destroying Oregon. So an interesting guy there. And we know how the Broncos seem to favor those Pac-12 Missouri Valley guys because they can play in altitude.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think, too, it's kind of the reverse psychology effect of Ryan Tannehill. I think it helps, ex-quarterbacks when they move to wide receiver because they kind of understand kind of the intricacies of a route potentially, at least of when a quarterback has to anticipate, a wide receiver's break. So they kind of have that in the back of their mind potentially. So I think it kind of helps with the transition. And maybe that's to say that a guy like Cedric Wilson could maybe have a leg up in that regard because of that. And the fact that he does have maybe a little bit of some talent along with that, I think certainly helps.
Yeah,
so,
for sure. Talent always helps.
Right.
That's one thing I found out. If you're talented, you have a chance.
Right.
No matter how much of an idiot you are. Sorry.
No, you're fine. So then I guess let's get into the most important position, and that is the one that's going to be talked about a lot, and that's going to be the quarterback position. The Broncos are going to be getting a look at, well, I hate to use the one word of intriguing with Tanner Lee, but he's at least intriguing enough because of how well he can throw a football. Doesn't mean it means it's to the other team or whatnot, but he does throw the football well. But Baker Mayfield and Josh Allen and Luke Falk. So it's a very popular named group, certainly. Although I don't think a lot of people know the name Tanner Lee, but I know the draft experts know the name Tanner Lee.
Honestly, I'd rather have Tanner Lee on my team than Luke Falk.
Yeah.
Not that I would take Tanner Lee before Luke Falk is taken, but the way draft works, you have guys that kind of fit your scheme, right, or what you want to do. And Falk, to me, I don't know. I don't really like him. I don't think he's got great pocket awareness, doesn't move well in the pocket, kind of that one read, get rid of the football and space, air raid guy. And you had Patrick Mahomes, in that system, and he got drafted, but Patrick Mahomes had a crazy arm and good athleticism.
Yeah.
I don't see great arm with Luke Falk. He throws with time and some anticipation, but there's just so many wobblers, and I don't really see any traits that are outstanding with him. So he's somebody I'm not very big on. Where Tanner Lee, he's a guy you can get end of day 3, depending on how he does throughout this process, but he's got decent athleticism, a good frame, and a downfield arm. And Nebraska wasn't really playing a system that they didn't really have a system for him. Last year the offensive line was putrid. He was hit every time, it seemed like. And kind of the same thing with Josh Rosen at UCLA. The offensive line got not very good unit, but he definitely intrigues me, and I'd be interested in taking him late. Potentially, you had Kirk Cousins, or not Kirk Cousins. Well, yeah, it was Kirk Cousins, but you had the Redskins, and they took RG3 early. And then, it'd be like this guy, Kirk Cousins as well. I think they took him in the 4th round to pair him up with RG3.
Yeah, 3rd, 4th round, yeah.
Yeah, just that insurance. I really don't mind a team, especially if they are taking a young quarterback, to take that insurance guy to push him and keep the heat on him, because, it's important to take quarterbacks. Look what the Patriots get for Garoppolo and all these other guys, so...
Yeah, and I guess that's the reason why Tanner Lee intrigues me, is because it's kind of I was talking with Eric, but I called it kind of the Joe Flacco syndrome. He's a guy that he didn't wow at all during games, potentially in the games that he had, or at least that not many people knew about. But then you kind of put him on a field, get the chance to play with a much better group. I mean, obviously the Senior Bowl roster is a much better group on the offensive line, and so on and so forth. Especially with the wide receivers. And I really like J.D. Spielman, and I like Stanley Morgan, the guys that they had there, but it's nothing like what he's going to be having at the Senior Bowl. So I think it's going to be a good measuring stick potentially for Tanner Lee of where he might be projected, because right now I don't think he's projected well. The performances that he threw up against nameless opponents, not to be derogatory there, but just it was nameless opponents, losing to Northern Illinois and especially the screen pass that was intercepted that he threw was awful. So I guess the thing with him is that he can throw the football, but the decision making and just his accuracy with the throws just have not been good. And it's just funny that you look at the best games that he had, 2 were blowouts, and they were also against the best competition, in Ohio State, Wisconsin, and Penn State. So and actually Penn State was probably the closest of all of them. I believe it was like 56-44 or something like that, but really it wasn't even close. It was garbage points, late in the game. So anyway, that's kind of my off tangent of why I really don't like Tanner Lee, but I'm intrigued about Tanner Lee. Anyway, Baker Mayfield. There's a lot of intrigue with Baker. I think personally, the Broncos really, really like Baker Mayfield. And I think that as far as the two quarterbacks is concerned, between Kirk Cousins and Baker Mayfield, those are their top two targets, in my opinion.
Yeah, they definitely are up there. Any of the top three guys, we're talking about High Huddle quarterback pieces being released in general. Kirk Cousins, Baker Mayfield, Josh Rosen, Sam Darnold. So they're definitely interested in those guys. From what I know, I don't think they're big on Josh Allen right now. Just been too inconsistent. But he has the stage. Who knows what's going to happen throughout this draft process? Crazier things have happened. So I'm not cheering against the guy. Just based on the tape I've seen, I would be surprised if he rose to the top three for the Broncos. I think he probably will be the fourth quarterback taken, but he's definitely a guy that's going to need a season or so to get developed and whatnot, and not have expectations for him. I still think one of the big reasons Lynch has been killed is because he was that project kind of guy. But the way the Broncos quarterback situation was set up, they needed him to be ready far sooner than he was. And obviously a chunk of it's on him, but I just don't think he was mentally or technically ready for that position. So he's definitely floundered.
Well, and again with Josh Allen, we really aren't dogging potentially the actual talent I think that Josh Allen has, because I think it's really good talent. He has the arm strength, he has the mobility. The mobility's there, and he has the ability to throw in tight windows. He has a great arm. It's just the inconsistencies are there, and the footwork I think is horrendous. I don't like his footwork. And so I think that ultimately that's why he is the top 5 quarterback, in the draft class. And that's not bad. If you're considered the top 4 or top 5 quarterback in the class, that's not bad.
He'll be a top 15 pick in the draft.
Right.
So he's going to be, unless something astronomical happens personally or he just tanks it down the stretch, but he's going to be a millionaire. So I'm not cheering against him, but it is what it is. He's still going to go early because somebody's going to love the tools.
Right, exactly. I think that's the one thing about the quarterback position, probably compared to any of the other positions, that's aside from a massive position of need. But it's a quarterback-driven league, and so ultimately it's going to be, one of those positions that there will be teams that's desperate. And when they are desperate, not to use the term reach, but they reach, they have a tendency to kind of reach for a bit for some of the talent. And speaking of Josh Allen,
when you're wearing rose-colored glasses, all the red flags just look like flags. So if you're trying to fall in love with a guy, find a quarterback, even if he's not it, you might look past it and just be too fixated on that position. Yeah,
and speaking of the Josh Allen traits and everything like that, apparently, according to Mel Kiper, he has him as the number 1 pick in the draft, going to the Cleveland Browns, which kind of shocked a lot of people, and it certainly shocked me. I thought for sure it would have been either Sam Darnold, ultimately maybe Josh Rosen, but we all know, I think, at least in my estimation, that it's going to be, at least right now, Sam Darnold to Cleveland and then Josh Rosen to the Giants, at least right now.
Yeah, definitely possible. I think that Josh Allen was probably put in there by Kiper because he's trying to get us to talk about it, and here we are right now talking about it.
Right.
So it's his first one, and it's going to generate buzz because, Josh Allen. Whatever, so it'll move around and whatnot. It's got to change. He can't keep it the same every week. It's not his big board. He's just putting names with kind of fits in where kind of guys are at and generating talking points.
But what's interesting, I guess, in this mock draft is when you put Josh Allen at number 1, it basically is the best case scenario for the Denver Broncos, because it forces, at least in our eyes, it forces those top-tier quarterbacks to fall down. And when they fall down, they kind of fall right into your lap. And because of that, the Broncos landed Sam Darnold in Mel Kiper's mock draft, which, not to toot my own horn, is kind of the mock draft that I laid out on the mock draft that I did for Predominantly Orange. I mean, I kind of was outlining the Josh Allen scenario that Cleveland was going to plan on taking Josh Allen, and which opened the door for a guy like Sam Darnold, to be taken by the Denver Broncos. And so I had Sam Darnold be taken, by the Denver Broncos. So maybe Mel Kiper plagiarized my mock draft idea.
Potentially.
Right. So I think that's really the only way that you can really describe Mel Kiper's draft is just the fact that when you put Josh Allen with Cleveland, and I mean, there are reports, I mean, I don't think Mel Kiper was throwing it out there all willy-nilly, but there are reports out there, at least, that the Cleveland Browns do like Josh Allen a whole lot.
Yeah, from the sounds of it, if Josh Rosen is true about not wanting to go there, they're going to go with a guy with a bigger size and a bigger arm, so that probably rules out Baker Mayfield, unless, Baker Mayfield could absolutely just knock it out of the park this whole draft process and could rise up. I mean, stranger things have happened. Guy's been doubted his whole life. Well, I mean, maybe he goes all the way to the top. But from what I know about Cleveland, or what I've heard, they're definitely in talks for Alex Smith. Granted, that could change. Maybe the Cardinals jump in and offer more, but I think the Cleveland will walk away with Alex Smith in the end. So kind of guys that are talented but more projects. Guys, at least you have Josh Allen and Sam Darnold. So those are the two guys I think probably make the most sense there for them, especially if they are going with a guy like Alex Smith. And then they have that fourth pick as well, where they can add an offensive weapon, maybe, or another defensive weapon as well, or potentially trade down out of there. Maybe a team's going to be really wanting to jump the Broncos. You got the Jets that are behind them, the Redskins, and the Cardinals, all teams that are pretty desperate for quarterback right now. So maybe some team jumps the Broncos at 4 as well. But Cleveland has a lot of draft capital, and they're going to be a lot of cap room as well. And they're going to be able to move around and do some interesting things in this draft.
There was a really interesting draft that kind of hit the wire today. And it was by Daniel Jeremiah, who is a phenomenal follow for those of you guys that don't follow Daniel Jeremiah. He is definitely worth the follow. He put his first mock draft together. It was the, should I say, Kirk Cousins scenario? But it was the scenario that the Broncos were adding a free agent quarterback. Whether that was Kirk Cousins, whether that was, a Case Keenum or any of those guys. It was a scenario of the Broncos adding a free agent quarterback, which opened the door to protect that asset. And that asset was getting maybe the best guard to come into the NFL draft in maybe 5-10 years. And that would be Quentin Nelson as their 5th pick. But I think the thing that was intriguing was, considering a scenario where the quarterback situation had been solved according to this mock draft, Josh Rosen fell to the Jets at 6.
Won't happen. There's no trades projected in this mock,
right.
But I would be absolutely shocked if Josh Rosen fell past 3.
Yeah.
I'd be honestly shocked if he falls past 2. But we'll see what happens. In this scenario, I would probably have, even though I had Kirk Cousins, I would definitely trade down whoever wanted Rosen. So I think the Broncos probably go after Cousins, and if they don't, they have a chance to get Darnold, Rosen, or Baker Mayfield, and they might even have to trade up to 3 or 4 to do that. But I think that's probably the plan.
Yeah.
If I had to guess.
Right. I think the thing I really did like about the mock draft was just more the pick. And
I love Quentin Nelson. I'd come around on him for sure. I wasn't as big on the guard at first, but that's just me being staunchy about the positional value. But when you can get a guy like that that's definitely safe and going to be a unit-defining piece, and honestly a turn point kind of piece, because the Broncos' offensive line has been just such an Achilles heel for so long. You get a guy like that can dominate at that point. to put next to Garrett Bowles, who's going to be only that much better next year, and on that left side, you have a chance to really turn that offensive line around for hopefully 5-6 years and at least make it an average unit. Offensive line is kind of a thing where even if you have two great guys, it only takes one or two mediocre to poor guys that can make the whole unit kind of fall apart.
Yeah.
But adding Quentin Nelson makes it potentially to be one of the better units and gives the Broncos kind of a identity piece going forward. And furthermore, I'm kind of going on a monologue here, but you saw Bill Musgraves with the Raiders having two great guards in Cliche Osemele and Gabe Jackson that really just powered that power run game for the Raiders. And then you get a guy like Nelson and Ronald Leary to pair at guard, along with an athletic tackle like Bowles, and then potentially McGovern or Paradis at center, and another option at right tackle. I mean, they'll have to figure it out. But I really like what it does for the offensive line. It helps the Broncos finally get better up front, a place that they've been losing at game to game, week to week for far too long.
Well, I think, too, that the best part about it is it gives significant depth that they had never had on that offensive line. McGovern proved himself to at least be strongly considered to be a starter next year. So if they did not get a guy like Quentin Nelson, they at least could plug him in at the left guard and at least solidify that. Or if they wanted to, move Ronald Leary to left guard or wherever. But that's, again, still some more moving parts. However,
it'll look different next year. But I think it'll be improved, and I'm excited about the growth of some of the younger guys and having Leary back for another year. I think the offensive line will take another step forward this year. It was better this year than the year prior, and I'm looking forward to getting just that much better next year. It's not going to happen all at once, probably, but getting Quentin Nelson's about as strong of a start as you can get.
There was another mock draft that hit, I believe it was yesterday, by Pro Football Focus. And Pro Football Focus did their second mock draft. And ironically enough, and I don't know how they do their grades, but they had Baker Mayfield Baker Mayfield taken with the first selection of the Cleveland Browns. And then they had Sam Darnold to the Giants. They did not have Bradley Chubb taken by the Indianapolis Colts. They had Maurice Hurst from Michigan.
Crazy.
Minka.
I mean, he's got to jump out of the gym to go that high because he's not very long and he's kind of limited schematically, in my opinion.
Then they had Minka Fitzpatrick, who I guess they decided not to have a picture for. Anyway, so he was taken by Cleveland. So pretty good haul, Baker and Minka. And that left with Josh Rosen being drafted by the Denver Broncos. It's pretty crazy.
It's a dream scenario.
Well, and then they even have Lamar Jackson taken by the Jets. Bradley Chubb falling all the way to San Francisco, which would be scary. And Saquon Barkley falling all the way to Oakland. Josh Jackson going to Miami. Mason Rudolph even going in the first round to the Arizona Cardinals.
That won't happen. I think he's probably a mid-day 2 guy. He's meh.
Man, they're really high on Michael Gallup.
Yeah, I mean, they use their stats, but we'll see it once we'll see how it works out the Senior Bowl and everything. I think that Michael Gallup's probably more of a mid to late day 2 guy, personally, but he could test out of the gym. He's a very smooth route runner, and teams need that right now.
Yeah.
Units that need 3 or 4 wide receivers these days.
I say that because the Dallas Cowboys drafted him in the first round, at least according to this mock draft.
Yeah, Pro Football Focus put some interesting stuff out there, but it's because they rely heavily on their stats. So sometimes their stats, because it so much depends on the scheme, the guys around you, competition that you go against can lead to some guys going much earlier than they likely will go.
Yeah.
Well, it's a cool reference, or a cool source. I enjoy it a lot for especially the counting statistics, but sometimes their statistics don't quite add up. Like Jeff Hireman being one of the best tight ends in the NFL this past year, according to Pro Football Focus. Probably not. No.
Well,
no.
I mean, there's there's that, I guess, rumbling that he may not even be back next year.
Yeah,
so I mean,
he did not have a great year. I don't know.
And so for a guy that may have been the best blocking tight end on the team. Now, I mean, to his credit, I guess to Jeff Hireman's credit, he's had a lot of injuries. It's the Julius Thomas syndrome. He's had a lot of injuries, and potentially, to where he's been incredibly limited in Denver. I mean, I'm sure all of us would agree there, but he really hasn't done a whole lot to separate himself from the pack. And then I guess when you factor in that they decided to draft Jake Butt, who should have been a first-round to second-round tight end last year, I think it's safe to say that the Broncos will go to Jake Butt as their starter next year, and we'll see whether they go after tight end in the draft this year, or if they decide to go after and take a flyer on a guy like a Tyler Eifert on a 2-year deal or something, or go younger also with Trey Burton.
Can I kind of go with what I would do?
Yeah, what would you do?
I would see. I kind of have to start to formulate my own off-season plan. So first, I'm going to approach Kirk Cousins. Definitely interested in him. Just kicking the market because he is a good quarterback. I don't know if he's a true franchise changer, but you can win with him. And I trust John Elway to build a defense around a quarterback. All we really need. Not all we really need. Obviously, there are other issues, but if you have a competent quarterback and a guy who can build a defense like Peyton or like John Elway, I think you can get it done. I mean, look what the Eagles are doing right now. The Jags,
Saints,
and the Vikings. You competent quarterback play. You have an offensive defining piece, whether it be the offensive line or running back or something like that, and a dominant defense, and you can do things. So I think that can happen, and I would be interested in Cousins. If that doesn't happen, I would like to bring in Josh McCown. He kind of knows that he's that veteran backup type. Probably got another year or two in him. Been a guy who's been pretty good around the league, different types of offenses, and really well liked in his locker rooms and by his coaches. So then you have that quarterback. It's not the Mark Sanchez level horrible.
No.
The guy who can actually come in and do some stuff. And then, go in the draft and see if you can get a guy like Mayfield, Darnold, or Rosen where you're not painting yourself in a corner where he has to start week 1. But, if the team's struggling and the guy is ready to go, you can make that transition week 6, week 8, something like that.
Yeah, and that's just it. Not to dog what the Chicago Bears did last year, but it is kind of similar to at least the thought process of what I'm sure that they thought of when they did the Mike Glennon and Mitchell Trubisky scenario. I mean, I
think it kind of was, but they paid Glennon some really good money, actually.
Right.
I don't think you don't have to end up paying McCown crazy money because he's not entering that second contract.
Right, and that's the only difference is that the Broncos wouldn't be throwing 15 to 18 million at Josh McCown. I mean, he might get maybe a 1-year deal that's probably upwards of 12 to 14 million, maybe not even
10,
that.
10 to 14.
Yeah, maybe not even that. But I think the reason why I kind of like that scenario, the way that you outline it, is just it doesn't deter you from going after a quarterback, in the first or second round.
I think it encourages you because it just means that you're protecting that investment.
Yeah.
More so. And if you take a young quarterback like that, I know Broncos, we still have a good defense and everything, but if you're going with that young quarterback, I got news for you. It's probably not happening right away next year. It's not young quarterback, boom, Super Bowl. It's probably a year from now, 2 years from now, I think, because that quarterback's going to have to grow and the offense is going to have to morph, and you have to hope that the scheme and the coaching staff can evolve with it. Because the way this team is constructed right now, even with good defensive pieces and some good wide receivers, I don't see it happening right now as far as a Super Bowl contender. We could be a division contender, but the Denver Broncos aren't looking for division titles.
Right.
They want to go to the Super Bowl. So.
And I think that with Elway, I think that's why Cousins is ultimately going to be priority number 1. But really, as we've said multiple times, Elway's not a patient guy. And, I mean, if we honestly believe, maybe Elway had a change of heart. Maybe Elway and Joe Ellis and now Gary Kubiak in the front office are just kind of sitting, singing Kumbaya or whatever. I don't know. But maybe they're just kind of sitting there in the front office and then overall just thinking, you know what? let's change things this year. Let's, which would be my thought process. I mean, I've kind of come around the idea that personally, I think you need to draft a young quarterback and then have him groom and become better with guys like Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders, and it affords you the opportunity to re-sign Cody Latimer, or if they feel like they want to just take a cheap flyer on a guy like, I don't know, a Paul Richardson, if they want to groom him into potentially being a replacement for Emmanuel Sanders. So I just think that it frees you up with so many possibilities if you decide to go that young quarterback route. And so we'll see, I think. But, I mean, as we've all seen before, Elway is not a patient guy. So if we honestly believe that Elway is going to sit on his hands and be crickets all throughout the NFL free agency, you're kidding yourself. You really are.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to go do something, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did something crazy in the draft as well. I'm not talking, moving all the way up to 1, although, crazier things have happened.
Right.
But I think definitely if they don't get a quarterback in that free agency period that they really trust, look out for them for that trading up to that number 3, number 4, or even higher spot, because Elway's not going to sit around. He's going to find the guy he wants and go get him.
Well, and I think that's why, call me crazy, but it is the perfect situation for, at least for the Broncos, and you and I have talked about it in the message group that we have with Carl and Sayer and you and me. But I honestly believe that if John Elway really wants to make a nice boom offseason, really the two best pieces, if we really want to go off it, and I mean, I'm sure they'll address tight end, I'm sure, at some point, whether it is through free agents or whatever. But the best possible scenario to at least make it comfortable for your quarterback or for anybody as far as they protect, I guess it's multiple options, I should say, is the draft Quentin Nelson idea, or you get Saquon Barkley and you do trade up to number 3 and you get a guy like a Saquon Barkley. If you can have that in the back of your brain as a potential scenario, that's really going to help you overall, I think, next year, knowing the fact that Kirk Cousins is going to have a lot of security of a guy back there like he had when he was at Michigan State when he had Le'Veon Bell.
I mean, you get an offensive defining piece, like
yes.
we talked about.
Right.
You pair an offensive defining piece with a great defense, and you have a chance to do things, whether it be an incredible offensive line, incredible running back, or a great quarterback. Paired with a defense, anything can happen, especially a great quarterback. But, you have that one piece, like kind of like the Rams had with Gurley this year, what the Jags are doing with Fournette. You have that guy who changes how teams have to play you on defense.
Yeah.
And it opens things up, and then you pin your ears back with a great defense that's getting after the quarterback and creating turnovers, and you can win football games. So that's why the Eagles are still playing pretty good. They've got a good offensive line, some weapons like Ertz and everything, and then a great defense, really underrated defense, honestly. Vikings, same exact thing. I mean, Case Keenum's having a good year, but I put my reputation on it. I do not think he's that good of a quarterback.
Yeah.
They have an offensive line that's playing pretty solid right now. They got a couple guys that have stepped up. They even moved Remmers inside, and Riley Reif is playing great at left tackle. And then they got 2 really good wide receivers who can beat press coverage and make plays down the field and run great routes, and Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. You got a guy like Kyle Rudolph, who's got the size, a red zone weapon, and a seam threat. I mean, Kyle Rudolph's really underrated at tight end.
Yeah.
And then you pair it with probably one of the top 2 defenses in the NFL right now. So it's one great quarterback, or one Hall of Fame quarterback, maybe the best ever, versus 3 really good defenses. So sorry to totally split that from the draft, but it's going to be an interesting postseason. I'm excited for Sunday.
Yeah. I think, in kind of going back to the offensive line point, they really, as incredible as it would be to get a guy like Quentin Nelson at 5, this is when I think Will Hernandez has to come into play. And whether that's trading back into the first round or getting him early day 2, but if you can land Saquon Barkley and Will Hernandez with your first 2 picks, Oh, I would call that a victory. I would be doing jumping jacks.
It would depend on what happened at quarterback.
Right. So let's just say that they did get Kirk Cousins, and you got Saquon Barkley, and then you moved back into the first round, or you got Will Hernandez into day 2. I mean, that would be already, in just those first 2 picks, your team, at least in my opinion, would be better.
Yeah, well, I'm interested to see how Will Hernandez does at the Senior Bowl and everything, but there are definitely some offensive line pieces that will be had day 2. That's probably the strength of this draft. There's definitely a number, so you got to pick your flavor, which is what you want when you're trying to build your scheme. So Will Hernandez is definitely going to be a guy that fits the frame. Some other interesting guys like Martinez Rankin is interesting. Taylor Hearn's a guy that's not getting too much buzz right now, but played left guard at Clemson, and he's huge. I think he's 6'5", 330, and he's dominating and downhill as well. So that's a name that I think you're going to hear rise throughout the process going forward. And Tyrell Crosby, interesting. Martez Ivey. So I don't disagree with you. If you get Kirk Cousins and then get Saquon Barkley and then build the offensive line day 2, I think you're probably that's probably the quickest turnaround for the Broncos. Is it the best long-term turnaround? Compared to getting a guy like Mayfield, Rosen, or Darnold, and what you can develop them into, and the cap implications with Cousins, maybe not. But definitely interesting, and I mean, this is probably one of the more intriguing off seasons the Broncos have had since they were in the pursuit of Peyton Manning.
Yeah, no doubt. The 2016 draft, I mean, really, take away Paxton Lynch's name off of it, was a pretty good draft. Actually, I would actually argue that aside from the 2012 draft that was so instrumental in helping win Super Bowl 50, the 2016 draft was probably the best draft that John Elway had ever had. I mean, he got his fullback, Nebraska. He got I would say he drafted the safeties of the future in Will Parks and Justin Simmons. And Justin Simmons, in my estimation, is already the best young safety in the National Football League. At least he's right up there. At least he's right up there.
Jamal Adams was pretty killer this year.
Right. True. But I just think that he's definitely in that conversation already in year 2, which is saying something. And then, Adam Gotsis, he was in the ringer last season from Bill Collar. And then Bill Collar called him out, in the offseason, told him to get better, and really bulk up. And then he did, and he's kind of like a mini Derek Wolfe right now. He's really turned himself into a really good player. And we'll see, I think, to what this draft could end up being. I mean, who knows with the lack of playing time of a lot of players in that draft class, what that ends up doing to them as far as rushed and everything. And usually when you're playing Isaiah McKenzie and Garrett Bowles and just DeMarcus Walker and then D'Angelo Henderson late into the end of the season, who knows? But this draft, I agree, this draft is huge for the Denver Broncos, and especially it's appropriate that they are coaching the offensive side of the ball, and it's a very talented offensive side of the group.
Yeah, and I guess the wrapping up point, this is big for John Elway. A lot of his detractors say he was made by Peyton Manning, and good luck, I guess, by taking Von Miller. Although he still has to make the pick, but this is, in my opinion, John Elway is safe here for another. He has like a 5-year window to rebuild this. If we're even bad for another few years, I trust John Elway. I'd give him the time, but I don't think the fan base would be that patient. So this is a big draft for Elway. He has to come out and figure out some stability on the quarterback position, and the coaching staff has to get it right as well and correct the ship. I do like they're keeping, in hindsight now, I'm glad they are keeping the coaches, because I think that Giants position was the big one. So next year, if Denver potentially might be the big one, we'll see what happens if Vance Joseph does fail. But Vance Joseph was supposed to be a good evaluator of talent, and bringing in Kubiak and just totally rehauling it, but having some stability in the organization instead of rehauling it every single year, all that chaos. It's been John Fox to Kubiak to Peyton leaving to Vance Joseph. So it's unstable right now. So I'm glad to bring in some stability, and it gives them some time to really work on this draft. They have a lot of picks, and they have some cap space. So I mean, we might not be better record-wise next year. You never know what's going to happen. But I trust Elway to turn the ship around, get the young talent on here, and start to build this team back up to where they should be.
Yeah, and again, I probably was a little too harsh on Vance. But I'm coming around to the idea that, but again, I'm never the type of guy that is going to want to fire a guy after year one. Just, you do that.
Well, I mean, there are some circumstances
right
outside of football.
There are some circumstances that's just more probably off the field and certainly altercations potentially that could lead to that. But usually you never fire your first year head coach. And so once that happened, was I a little surprised by it? Maybe. But would I have been upset by a potential firing? Maybe not. But the fact of the matter is that this allows him to build a staff, his own staff, that he can be comfortable with, aside from a defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator. But ultimately he feels pretty comfortable with what he's done as a staff. And I think ultimately there is a very, very quiet buzz, I think, about the staff that's been put together. I mean, Mike Sullivan has the opportunity to work as a quarterback coach, potentially kind of going backwards, and he is a pretty good quarterback coach. I mean, and so who knows potentially what he could be doing with, say, a Kirk Cousins or a Case Keenum or a Baker Mayfield or Josh Rosen or Sam Darnold. Who knows? But he's at least shown the capacity to have quarterbacks play well for him. So and then just I think that just as far as the pieces that have been put together, it's only appropriate that you give him the same amount of patience. Doesn't mean a leash should at least be applied, in my opinion. I think a leash should at least be, say, mid-season. That if there's maybe not a ship, or the ship is significantly sinking, kind of like an 8-game losing streak this last season. If there's a same 8-game losing streak next season, well, then you might kind of want to pull the plug.
That's when it happens. Yep. There has to be some improvement organizationally. It sounded like there were some locker room issues this year. So you got to right the ship. You got to build that culture. And you got to bring in young guys that are fitting the system and getting better. And that was not the season. The season was unstable. The season was unfortunate. But hopefully we have some stability going forward. We have a little bit more of what we want to do, our identity, and figure out that quarterback position, improve the offensive line, and start building towards being a true threat in the AFC once again.
Absolutely. Before we take it off, though, your Super Bowl pick.
Are we going straight up Super Bowl or are we going spreads this weekend?
Just more Jacksonville, New England, Minnesota.
I think it'll be the Vikings versus the Patriots, and I think the Vikings are going to take it.
Yeah, I had the Saints against the Patriots, and it sure looked that way until Stephon Diggs, had a missed tackle, I should say. Yeah, I got to go Vikings and Patriots, but I'll be rooting the heck out of Jacksonville. I think it's going to be a good game between Jacksonville and New England, but
I'll take the under. Teams that have always given Bill Belichick fits are these Coughlin-built teams. Tom Coughlin, and he's the mastermind behind this Jacksonville team.
Yeah.
Really good defense. I mean, they got guys, especially up the interior, that can really get pressure in quarterbacks' faces. They're long, they're quick, they're athletic. I mean, they got really good interior defensive linemen. Malik Jackson, Calais Campbell, who I absolutely adore, and Marcel Darius with some edge rushing talent, speed at linebacker, 2 shutdown cornerbacks. So they're really talented, and the Vikings, great defense too. I mean, Philly, we're talking in circles now, great defenses, but yeah, I think this, especially with Leonard Fournette being a sledgehammer, if it's cold there, Leonard Fournette's the type that really starts to wear down defenses. So and Tom Brady having the hurt hand. So, well, it's going to be a fun game. I hope it's close.
Yeah, and we all can just cry in serenity, knowing that, or not serenity, but knowing that Calais Campbell should have been a Denver Bronco.
He made the right decision.
Right. Ultimately, he made the right decision, and it was probably the best because he's a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. He really is.
He made more money, and they're having a chance at the Super Bowl.
Right. Well, Nick, I appreciate your time, and I look forward to kind of seeing what the quarterback articles are going to be over at Mile High Huddle, and we got an East-West Shrine game coming up, the Senior Bowl coming up. It is a loaded week for the Denver Broncos as far as their draft preparation.
Yeah, and make sure you follow myself on Twitter at Nick Kendell, MHH. It's Kendell. And that comprehensive quarterback piece that I wrote he'll be out tomorrow. It's a long one. It took some time and some effort to write, but it's I guess you'd call it all encompassing, and I'm going to make the best argument I can for my guy.
Sometimes the best articles are the extensive articles, just to prove a point. Well, Hey man, I really do appreciate all that you guys do over at Mile High Huddle. I did the Twitter shout out today, but I really appreciate everything that you guys put forth down over there. And we may not agree or on a lot of things, but we have the ability to agree to disagree a lot, and there's a lot of mutual respect, I believe, between Predominantly Orange and Mile High Huddle. So we respect you guys over there and the work that you guys do.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's we're big nerds, I guess, is the big thing. And when you have people that are obsessed with something like we are in football, and especially watching tape and figuring out the intricacies that is the NFL draft, I mean, you have some original and interesting content. So we love doing it, and thank you for having me on to talk. Love talking football with you. I think I'm getting you a little bit more draft obsessed as well.
I'm definitely.
Which is a good thing. I'm planting the seeds.
Yeah, you're clearly getting me draft obsessed. I should say I started last year, but it's growing. I mean, it's getting there, and I think that I'm getting better. I know that I'm actually getting better. So my second mock draft will be hitting here over the weekend, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, look out for that quarterback piece tomorrow. You have to let me know what you think when it's out.
I will. I'll share it even.
Hey, go look at Eric's as well on Mayfield.
I will. Well, Nick, man, thank you very much for coming on, and we'll definitely do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl's going to have a good week in Mobile, and I'm going to be excited for the Senior Bowl, so until next time.
Hell, we will be crying, wishing we were down there. Have a good one, man.
Yep, you too. Have a good weekend.
You too. That was Nick Kendell, the draft analyst, the really good draft analyst for the for Mile High Huddle, and a lot of people down there are so good. Eric Trickle and Carl Dummler alongside with him, and Khalid Al-Shami is another one. It's just a loaded group, and I think Draft Twitter brings a lot of people together as far as some insight and everything. So it's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to come together, and for everybody that's involved with it. The insights just they continue to grow, and it's just an opportunity for everybody to really put forth their opportunity and insight, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to have that mutual respect with Mile High Huddle, and especially with the work that we do over at Predominantly Orange. So, well, guys, thank you very much for tuning in to this edition of the Cam Parker Show. It's continuing to get different. It's continuing to get a little bit broader because we talk about the draft. We talk about the Broncos. We talked about the Colorado Avalanche and why hockey in Colorado is so vastly underappreciated or underrated. So we touch on a lot of different things here on the Cam Parker Show. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the Cameron Parker Show. And if you haven't subscribed to the Cameron Parker Show, you can do so on iTunes. You can listen to the show on iHeartRadio. You can listen to the show on Spreaker, which is the main studio for the Cameron Parker Show. Thank you, as always, for making the Cam Parker Show part of your guys' evening. Follow the show handle at CP_show. Follow my handle at Cameron Parker PO. You can follow Nick Kendell at Nick Kendell MHH. And also follow at Mile High Huddle for their exclusive content as far as their quarterback articles that will be hitting today or tomorrow. So it is going to be a jam-packed weekend. The East-West Shrine game coming up over the weekend tomorrow. And then, obviously, the Senior Bowl that will be covered extensively by Sayer Bettinger and Carl Dummler, one at Mile High Huddle and the other over at Predominantly Orange. So it's going to be a very fun week for the Denver Broncos. So thank you guys very much for tuning in, and I will be back on Tuesday, and I'll see if I can get Sayer on during the Senior Bowl week, because that is the first official day of the Senior Bowl. This has been the Cam Parker Show.